To understand medieval maps, you have to first understand what came before them and what was lost. The Romans were practical people. Their maps reflected that. They weren't very interested in showing the precise shape of continents. They wanted to know how to get their legions from one place to another. They wanted to know where the roads were, where the towns were, and how long it would take to march. The most famous example we have is a copy of a Roman map called the Puttinger Table. It looks strange to us. It's long and skinny like a scroll. Italy is stretched out sideways. The sea is just a thin blue line. It's not a geographically accurate picture of the world. It's a road map, it's like a modern subway map. The goal isn't to show you the real world, but to show you the connections between points and the distances involved. It was useful for administration, for military campaigns, for trade. It was a tool for running an empire. The Greeks, on the other hand, were more philosophical. They were interested in the shape of the world itself. They were mathematicians and astronomers. A man named Eratosthenes, way back in the 3rd century BC, calculated the circumference of the Earth with surprising accuracy. He did it using shadows and basic geometry. Think about that. He knew the Earth was a sphere. Later, a scholar named Claudius Ptolemy, living in Roman Egypt, wrote a book called Geographia. This book was a huge achievement. Ptolemy gathered all the known geographic information he could find from travelers and other writers. He tried to create a system to map the entire known world. He developed a grid system, a forerunner of our latitude and longitude. He understood that you can't just draw a curved surface on a flat piece of paper without some distortion. He proposed different ways to project the globe onto a map. His work was the peak of ancient cartography. It was a scientific attempt to represent the world as it actually was. But then the Roman Empire in the West fell apart. Things got chaotic. Libraries were burned. Trade routes were disrupted. The big, centralized government that had produced maps like the Pottinger Table was gone. In Western Europe, a lot of that Greek and Roman knowledge was simply lost. Very few people could read Greek anymore, so Ptolemy's Geographia was basically unreadable. The world, for many Europeans, shrank. Their focus turned inward. Life became more local, centered on a village or a monastery. The big questions weren't about the exact size of India or the coastline of Britain. The big questions were about God, salvation, and the meaning of life. This change in thinking created a new kind of map. It wasn't based on scientific measurement or practical travel, it was based on faith. The most common type of map from the early Middle Ages is called a TO map. It's incredibly simple. Imagine a circle, the O. This circle represents the world, surrounded by a great ocean. Inside the circle, a T is drawn. The vertical part of the T is the Mediterranean Sea. The horizontal part represents the Don and Nile rivers. This T divides the world into 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And Asia was at the top, and it was the largest. Europe was on the bottom left, Africa on the bottom right. This wasn't a map for finding your way, it was a map for understanding your place in a divine plan. The 3 continents were believed to be populated by the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, Shem for Asia, Japheth for Europe, and Ham for Africa. At the very center of the map, right where the T crossed, was Jerusalem. This was the spiritual center of the world, the place where Christ had died and would return. And at the very top of the map, in Asia, was the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise. The east was at the top. This is why we still use the word orientation, which comes from orient, the east. To orient a map meant to place the east, the direction of paradise and the rising sun, at the top. The TO map wasn't wrong. It was just answering a different question. The question wasn't, what does the world look like, but what does the world mean? Christian cosmology, neat and tidy. It provided a sense of order in a world that often felt dangerous and disordered. This simple, symbolic map became the foundation of European cartography for centuries. It was the mental image of the world that most educated people carried in their heads. While the simple TO map was a common diagram in books, some mapmakers created much larger, more detailed works. These are known as mapi mundi, which is just Latin for maps of the world. These were not meant to be carried in a saddlebag. They were huge, impressive objects, often drawn on a single large piece of animal skin. They were works of art, encyclopedias, and sermons all rolled into one. They were usually displayed in cathedrals or palaces where they could be seen by many people. Their purpose was to teach. They presented a complete picture of the world, not just its physical features, but its history, its marvels, and its spiritual significance. The most famous surviving example is the Hereford map, made around the year 1300 in England. It's a stunning piece of work, over 5 feet tall. Looking at it is like stepping into the medieval mind. Just like the TO maps, Jerusalem is right at the center. At the very top, in the east, you don't just see a label for the Garden of Eden. You see a picture of it, a walled-off paradise with Adam, Eve, and the serpent. And just outside, you see them being expelled. Above the entire map, Christ sits in judgment showing his wounds, with angels on either side. The whole world is framed by this divine drama, from creation to the last judgment. The map is filled with stories. You can see Noah's Ark resting on a mountain. You can see the Tower of Babel, a symbol of human pride. You can see the pillar of salt that was Lot's wife. You can trace the path of the Israelites out of Egypt across a Red Sea that is literally painted red. The map mixes biblical history with classical mythology and medieval folklore. You can find the Golden Fleece, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur, and the camp of Alexander the Great. It's a visual collection of all the important stories that a person was expected to know. Geography is secondary to this storytelling. Europe is a crowded space on the bottom left, with recognizable names like Rome, Paris, and London. But the shapes are all wrong. The British Isles are squashed and distorted. The mapmaker wasn't trying to get the coastlines right. He was trying to fit everything in. The further you get from the known world of Europe, the stranger things become. Africa and Asia are filled with wonders and horrors. The map is populated by what we now call the monstrous races. These were creatures described by ancient Roman writers like Pliny the Elder. There are the Cyapods, who have only one giant foot, which they use to shade themselves from the sun. There are the Blemmeyes, who have no heads, but have their faces in their chests. There are cynocephali, men with the heads of dogs. To a modern eye, this seems ridiculous. But to the medieval viewer, it made a kind of sense. The world was God's creation, and it was full of marvels beyond their everyday experience. These strange peoples lived at the edges of the known world, in the mysterious lands of the south and east. They represented the unknown, the other. Putting them on the map was a way of containing them, of giving them a place in the ordered world. It also served as a warning. The world outside of Christendom was a strange and sometimes dangerous place. The Hereford map, and others like it, shows us that a map can be more than just a tool for navigation. It can be a way of organizing all of human knowledge. It tells you where you are, not just geographically, but historically and spiritually. You are in a world created by God, centered on the holy city of Jerusalem. Your history began in Eden and will end with Christ's judgment. And you are surrounded by a world of wonders, dangers, and people who are not like you. This was the world as seen from the cathedral. It was a map of belief. It was powerful and convincing. And for many, it was the only map of the world they would ever see. At the same time that monks were drawing these beautiful symbolic maps of the world, another kind of map was being made. This other kind of map was not made in a monastery. It was made in the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean, places like Genoa, Venice, and Palma de Mallorca. And it was made for a completely different purpose. It was made for getting a ship full of valuable cargo from one port to another without sinking. These were the Portolan charts. The name comes from the Italian word portolano, which means pilot book. These were practical working documents. If a mappa mundi was a sermon, a Portolan chart was a tool. It looked completely different. There was no Garden of Eden, no monstrous races, no Jerusalem at the center. In fact, there was almost no information about the inland areas at all. The interior of Spain or Italy might be completely blank. What the chart focused on, with incredible detail and accuracy, was the coastline. Every bay, every headland, every river mouth was drawn with care. The map was covered with the names of ports and harbors, written perpendicular to the coast so a sailor could read them easily. This was the information that mattered. The most striking feature of a Portolan chart is the web of thin lines that crisscross the entire map. These are called rum lines. They radiate out from a series of compass roses placed in a circle on the chart. These lines represent the 32 directions of a mariner's compass. A sailor could use these lines to plot a course. They would find their starting port and their destination. Then they would use a straight edge to find the rum line that connected them, or ran parallel to their desired course. This line would give them their compass bearing. They could then try to follow that bearing, using their compass and estimating their speed to reach their destination. It was a revolutionary way to navigate the open sea. These charts were a huge leap forward in practical cartography. The accuracy of the Mediterranean coastline on a 14th century Portolan chart is astonishing. It's far more accurate than anything Ptolemy had produced 1,000 years earlier. How did they do it? We don't know for sure. The makers of these charts were practical craftsmen, not scholars. They didn't write books explaining their methods. They likely built up their knowledge over generations. Sailors would have kept detailed logs of distances and compass bearings between ports. They would have made sketches of coastlines. Over time, this information was compiled, corrected, and refined by professional chart makers. They combined the new technology of the magnetic compass with centuries of hard-won sailing experience. This created a fascinating split in medieval cartography. You had two different traditions existing side by side. In the library of a monastery, you might find a mappa mundi that showed the world as a spiritual drama. It was a map of theology. Down at the docks, a ship's captain would have a Portolan chart rolled up in a tube. It was a map of coastlines and compass bearings. It was a map of commerce. The monk and the captain had two completely different pictures of the world. One was concerned with the why of creation, the other was concerned with the how of navigation. For a long time, these two traditions didn't interact much. The makers of the Mappe Mundi didn't seem to use the information from the Portolan charts to correct their geography. And the Portolan chart makers had no use for pictures of headless men or the Tower of Babel. They were solving different problems, but the Portolan charts represented a new way of seeing the world. They were based on direct observation and measurement. They were tested on every voyage. If a chart was wrong, a ship could be wrecked and lives lost. It was a world where accuracy mattered. This empirical, data-driven approach to mapping was a quiet revolution. It pointed the way toward the future, a future where maps would be seen not as pictures of belief, but as scientific instruments. The world for most medieval Europeans was a small place. Their maps reflected that. The detailed, story-filled Mappe Mundi were focused on Europe and the Holy Land. The practical Portolan charts rarely went beyond the Mediterranean and Black Seas and the Atlantic coast of Europe and North Africa. But the world was, of course, much bigger, and slowly, information from the outside world began to trickle back into Europe, forcing map makers to stretch their old frameworks. One major source of new information was the Crusades. For centuries, thousands of Europeans traveled to the Near East to fight. They came back with more than just relics. They came back with a better sense of the geography of the Holy Land and the lands on the way. The world of the Bible became a real place for them, with real cities and real roads. This didn't fundamentally change the theological nature of their world maps, but it did add a layer of detail and realism to the most important part of the map. Merchants and missionaries were even more important. As trade routes expanded, men like Marco Polo ventured far beyond the traditional boundaries of Christendom. Marco Polo's journey to China in the late 13th century, and the book he wrote about it, was a sensation. He described a vast, wealthy, and highly organized empire that was far beyond anything Europeans could imagine. He talked about cities with millions of people, paper money, and a powerful Khan. For mapmakers, this was a challenge. How do you fit this enormous, detailed land of Cathay onto a map that was designed around Jerusalem and the Garden of Eden? The Catalan Atlas, made in Majorca around 1375, is a great example of this fusion. It's a mix of the old and the new. It has the clear, practical style of a Portolan chart for the Mediterranean world. The coastlines are accurate, and the rum lines are there. But when it moves east into Asia, it becomes more like a Mappa Mundi. It's filled with illustrations of foreign kings, exotic animals like camels and elephants, and caravans crossing the desert. It includes information from Marco Polo's travels, showing the lands of the Great Khan. It's an attempt to integrate the new, first-hand knowledge of travelers with the traditional Portolan style. The world was getting bigger and more complex, and maps had to adapt. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that medieval European cartography was not the only game in town. In the Islamic world, geographers and mapmakers had preserved and built upon the Greek traditions that had been lost in Europe. They had access to Ptolemy's Geographia. They also had a vast trading network that stretched from Spain to Southeast Asia, providing them with a steady stream of new information. One of the greatest mapmakers of the entire medieval period was a man named Muhammad al-Idrisi. He worked in the 12th century, not in Baghdad or Damascus, but in Sicily, at the court of the Norman king Roger II. The king commissioned him to create a definitive map and geography of the entire known world. For 15 years, al-Idrisi and his team collected information. They interviewed experienced travelers and merchants. They sent out expeditions with artists and draftsmen to map new regions. They carefully compared different sources and tried to weed out fictions and exaggerations. The result was a book called the Tabula Rogeriana, or the Book of Roger. It was accompanied by a large map of the world engraved on a silver disc, which has since been lost. The book and its surviving map copies are a masterpiece. The world map is far more detailed and geographically advanced than any contemporary Mappa Mundi. It shows a deep understanding of the trade routes of the Indian Ocean and the interior of Africa. It's not perfect, of course, but it's based on a systematic, almost scientific collection of data. Interestingly, al-Idrisi's map is oriented with south at the top. This was a common convention in Islamic cartography. It's a powerful reminder that our own convention of north is up is just that, a convention, not a rule. The work of al-Idrisi and other Islamic geographers shows that the medieval world was not a dark age for cartography. It was only dark in certain parts of it. While much of Christian Europe was creating symbolic maps of faith, the Islamic world was creating sophisticated maps based on mathematics and empirical data. This knowledge didn't immediately transfer to Europe, but as contact between the Christian and Islamic worlds increased, especially in Spain and Sicily, these ideas began to flow. The rich, detailed knowledge of the world held by Islamic scholars would eventually play a crucial role in expanding Europe's own vision of the globe. The late Middle Ages was a period of great change, and this was reflected in the world of maps. Two big things happened that would completely shatter the old medieval worldview and pave the way for modern cartography. One was the rediscovery of an old book, the other was the discovery of a new world. The book was Ptolemy's Geographia. As we saw, this work had been the high point of ancient scientific cartography, but it was lost to Western Europe for 1,000 years. Around the year 1400, it was brought from Constantinople to Italy and translated from Greek into Latin. For the scholars and mapmakers of the early Renaissance, it was a revelation. Here was a systematic, mathematical way to map the world. Ptolemy provided a list of thousands of places with their coordinates of latitude and longitude. He gave instructions on how to project the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat map. This was a radical departure from the Mappi Mundi. Instead of a world organized by theology and story, Ptolemy offered a world organized by a mathematical grid. His maps could be drawn to a consistent scale. The relative size and position of continents and countries could be calculated. It was a powerful idea and it spread quickly. Mapmakers began to create new maps based on Ptolemy's principles. These new maps looked much more modern to our eyes. They had a grid of latitude and longitude lines. Africa began to take on a more recognizable shape. India was no longer a small island, but a large peninsula. But Ptolemy's map was 1,000 years old. It was brilliant, but it was also full of errors. He had underestimated the size of the Earth. He had overestimated the size of Asia, making it stretch much further east than it actually does. And his map showed no Americas, no Australia, and no Pacific Ocean. His world was much smaller than the real one. This is where the explorers came in. Driven by a desire for new trade routes to the east, sailors began to push the boundaries of the known world. The Portuguese carefully mapped the coast of Africa, eventually rounding the Cape of Good Hope and reaching India by sea. This proved that the Indian Ocean was not a landlocked sea, as Ptolemy and many medieval maps had shown. And then, of course, came Christopher Columbus in 1492. Columbus was a great sailor, and he was also influenced by the new Ptolemaic way of thinking. He believed Ptolemy's calculations that Asia stretched far to the east. He also believed the Earth was smaller than it is. He put these two errors together and concluded that he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. He was wrong, but his mistake led to an even bigger discovery, an entire hemisphere that no European map had ever shown. The discovery of the Americas was the final blow to the old medieval map. The simple TO map with its 3 continents was obviously wrong. The Mappi Mundi with their Garden of Eden at the far eastern edge of Asia no longer made sense. Even Ptolemy's great map was now hopelessly incomplete. The world was suddenly, dramatically bigger and stranger than anyone in Europe had imagined. Mapmakers scrambled to keep up. This was the beginning of the Great Age of Exploration. Every new voyage brought back new data, new coastlines, new islands. Maps became instantly out of date. You can see this in the maps from the early 1500s. The first map to use the name America was made by a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller in 1507. On his map, the new continent is still a bit vague and misshapen, a guess based on early reports. But it's there. The world had a 4th continent. This marks the end of the medieval cartographic era. The transition was complete. The purpose of a map was no longer primarily to illustrate faith or tell a story. It had become a vital tool for power, trade, and science. A good map could give a king a claim to new territory. It could guide a merchant fleet to new wealth. It could help a scientist understand the true shape of the planet. Medieval cartography wasn't a single thing. It was a rich and complex mix of different traditions. There was the inherited memory of Roman practicality. There was the deep spiritual symbolism of the Christian Mappi Mundi. There was the hard one, practical knowledge of the sailors and their Portolan charts. And there were the whispers and rumors of the wider world brought back by travelers and traders. For 1,000 years, these different ways of seeing the world coexisted, but in the end, the world itself proved too big, too strange, and too complex for the old maps to hold. A new world demanded a new kind of map.